All right, welcome to today's online seminar on Research Data Management Onboarding. As a note, this session is being recorded and you will receive a notification when the recording and the slides are available. So I'm Julie Goldman, Research Data Services Librarian at Countway Library at Harvard Medical School. And today I'm also joined by Sarah Hauserman from HMS Information Technology and Meghan Kerr from the Center for the History of Medicine. And we are all members of the Longwood Medical Area Research Data Management Working Group. And this is a working group of members of the LMA community from many areas, such as the library, information technology, research computing, our research cores, and affiliate hospitals. And we maintain a website full of resources and information, including key checklists we will discuss today. So I really suggest that you bookmark this website and reference it as you need. And throughout today's presentation, you will also notice links to certain areas of this website for you to get more information on the topics we'll cover today. So today we are highlighting the role of research data management in the onboarding process, and our learning objectives are to become familiar with the research data lifecycle, understand the details and requirements at each stage of data management onboarding, engage with best practices to enhance your current and future research, and you'll receive, the resources and contacts for future help. So let's start with a quick overview. So data management covers how data is organized, backed up, and documented. Basically, it's, can you or someone else find data and use your data? And data management is a part of data sharing, which is increasingly visible because of concerns related to research, reproducibility, and transparency. And if the purpose of sharing data is to allow others to examine or build upon your work, it's important that it's managed in a way that makes that actually possible. And if you're not sharing data publicly, you personally still don't want to lose your data or lose track of your analyses. And research data management happens throughout this life cycle of a research project to guide, the planning, the collection, the documentation, storage, sharing, and preservation of your research data. And to understand the process of managing data throughout the life cycle of a project, we should also, define what research data is. So research data may be collected or created or acquired in many different ways in your project. It may result from projects conducted at the university and on Harvard property. It may be developed or collected under the direction of the university, even if research activities may be occurring elsewhere. Or data may be collected with university resources, such as equipment or funding. And then in order to successfully manage that data, you may have to work with a network of people and groups. So no one entity at the university is responsible for the management of your research data. So today we really want to highlight the fact that research data management is a collaborative effort. In order to successfully maintain data throughout its life cycle, you need input from research administration, information technology, and the library. So throughout this presentation, as you can see, myself, Meghan, and Sarah are from different areas of the university. So we'll point out the areas we can help with and how a network of groups will ultimately lead to more cohesive management of your data. All right, so to get us started, I want you all to think about why you think data management is important for onboarding. Ideally, since you are here, you understand the need for managing your data. But why do you think we should put some extra emphasis on it during this onboarding or orientation process? So I invite you to add, some thoughts to the chat. So you can answer this question in the chat. And maybe you have some thoughts, generally on the benefits of managing data, or perhaps you have a personal experience you can share with us. So I'll give you a second or two to think about this question and add some of your thoughts to the chat. Yeah, so some nice comments on, maintaining consistent practices, making sure all folks are on the same page. And this helps with, our results validity. So many people can, quality check, assurance. Yeah, and good comments on, collaborating and working with collaborators. Again, to make sure everyone's on the same page. Yeah, great. So, here are some of the reasons, we have come up with. And as you can see, we should be creating, as someone mentioned, those standards. So we should be creating, using, and promoting these lab standards. And this helps, when new collaborators, newcomers are added to a lab or a project, they get acquainted with those standards. And this ensures, just the success of those long-term projects. Awesome. So as I mentioned, our working group has created a checklist that can be used to guide the steps and resources involved in RDM onboarding. So in today's session, we will use this checklist to review these steps and resources available at Harvard. And you can find this checklist at the link provided. And there are two versions, a comprehensive and abridged version. And today we will review the full comprehensive version. Then we really suggest that you maybe use the shortened abridged version as maybe an actionable list to actually implement the practices you learned today. And the onboarding checklist has been broken into one for joining a new lab and one for joining a new project. But since, many of the activities overlap in these kind of two scenarios, we will review them together. And finally, there are three sections of our checklist: planning, storage, and sharing, which we will go through in detail. So you are really encouraged to, follow along with your checklist that can be downloaded at the link. I put the link in the chat. So now I'm going to, turn it over to Meghan to lead us through the planning section.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be going over the planning section. In this section, I'll go over data management plans, data use agreements, the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and how to overall apply the onboarding checklist to your workflow. Oops, sorry if the slides aren't going. There we go. So first, we're going to start with what you should do when you join a lab. When you join a lab at Harvard, you should acquaint yourself with the applicable university policies. You should ask the PI or the department research administrator for existing policies, review the office for the vice provost for research's retention and maintenance of research records FAQs. And that FAQ has a lot of information that's useful if you're on the Harvard campus. So I definitely would check that out. And also be aware that the Longwood Medical Area Archives and Records Management Program is here to answer your questions about data retention. And you should also review Harvard's newly updated data security policy. And lastly, the university's information security policy. So there's a lot of information that you should look into and become acquainted with. And as you start working, you'll come across these things as you go. but just really know that these exist and that you should look into them when you start in a lab. Before working with research data, you should know the university's policies regarding data retention. Retention is the length of time data needs to be kept according to institutional policies. So here at Harvard, you're required to retain essential research data for a minimum of 7 years. And the retention period is also based on funder, state, and our federal guidelines. Ultimately, the retention will depend on the type of data, the purpose for which the data has been collected, policies of funding institutions or the parent organization, such as the IRB. At Harvard, we have the General Record Schedule, which contains the retention period for all records created at Harvard. And you also should be aware of the Office of Technology Development when it comes to intellectual property. Retention will also depend on the long-term historical value of the data. But researchers are responsible for understanding these retention expectations of the funders and the institution. And overall, it will help with budget planning and determining future storage needs and overall records oversight if you know about the retention policies ahead of time. So maintaining comprehensive and accurate research records and data is an important component of any research project and may be an obligation for the researcher long after the project has ended. Especially here at Harvard, if you need to retain data for 7 years, it's going to be an ongoing process and you need to be aware of what you should be doing. And data retention requirements are put in place by these funding agencies and sponsoring institutions for a multitude of reasons, including to make the research findings available for corroboration, to promote the reuse of data within and across disciplines, and to also support open data initiatives. So when it comes to your lab, first follow your lab standards practices, if they do exist. If they don't have any standards, develop your own, write them down, and make sure you follow them. At a minimum, keep your data for 7 years and store the data on university property or university systems. Intellectual property, human subject information, and other factors will affect retention. So before you delete your data, check with your lab and sponsor guidelines first. And if you do have IP, intellectual property, make sure you do talk to the Office of Technology Development. And if you're not sure of your options, always contact Harvard IT. And remember, if you do leave Harvard and would like a copy of your data, you will need to discuss this with your PI because certain agreements will need to be drafted. One thing I just wanted to point out when it comes to data retention is that long-term storage and archiving can often be confused with one another. Long-term storage is the storage of research records to meet the requirements of the granting agency or institution, whereas archiving is a permanent retention of research data for reuse by other researchers. Archiving of research data is based on an appraisal process. So when the time comes, I usually look at the volume, the data types, metadata, the impact or significance of the research, and really basic information about the grant. And I also interview the PI to get some more background information. So in order for data to be retained permanently, there needs to be clear ownership, needs to be comprehensive and contextualized. Here are a few regulations and policies to be aware of. I'm sure many of you have heard of most of these, HIPAA for patient information, FERPA for student information, but also Massachusetts state laws regarding data protection, de-identifying stem cell and genomics data, and also the General Data Protection Regulation from the EU that came out in 2018. And lastly, at Harvard, as I've mentioned, you need to retain your data for 7 years in the appropriate storage environment based off the security level that is assigned to your data. Later in the class, Sarah will go over the different security levels here at Harvard that you'll be able to understand to see where your data fits in, where it should be stored. So the next part of the planning process is when you're joining a new project, is transferring any prior data and related records to Harvard. In order to do this, you will need a data use agreement or a DUA. DUAs stipulate how the data can be accessed and its treatment once transferred. The HMS Office of Research Administration and the HSPH Office for Sponsored Programs are the authorized DUA signatories for Harvard and will help you with obtaining a DUA. And we have more information about that process in detail if you do need to attain a DUA, but I'll just briefly go over some parts of it. So DOAs address the limitations on the use of the data, obligations to safeguard the data, liability for harm arising from the use of the data, and any publication or privacy rights that are associated with transfers of confidential or protected data. And a DOA must be purpose specific. So in other words, data cannot be transferred pursuant to a blanket sharing agreement without a unique implementing letter identifying the specific data sets and uses. So you have to be detailed about what data sets being transferred and how it can be used. The next step along the same lines as reviewing data management policies when joining a new lab, very similar. You'll have to find out what your grant stipulates regarding data management and also any sharing requirements. So when you're joining a new project, you should be aware of if there's any human subjects research or animal research, and review any project-specific requirements stipulated by the IRB or the Standing Committee on Animals. So make sure you're aware of those features. And you also need to look into the funding requirements. So some funders require data management or data sharing plans. The NIH has a data sharing policy, but if you are funded by a different sponsor, you should find out what plans are required by the funders. More and more funders are requiring data management plans or DMPs. So when starting on a new project, you should construct a DMP or review the existing one. A DMP should describe data organization, storage, data security, final data set formats, data sharing agreements, and retention plans. It's important to think about the full life cycle of the data in the beginning of the project and plan for each step of the way. So here are some more examples of what should be described in a DMP. You also should be looking at security, any data sharing agreements that you'll have later in the project, and any roles and responsibilities for data management throughout the entire project. So who's going to be that person that's overseeing everything? There's also a tool that can be helped with this process called DMP tool. And Harvard has signed on to this tool. And so we have an online service available where you can create templates that are based on templates from a variety of funders. And Harvard has its own instance, so we have some pre-populated templates, and we're currently working on some specific to Harvard. So although you create a DMP at the start of a project, be sure to follow and modify the plan as you go throughout the whole life cycle of your project. And we have offered classes in the past on DMP tool. I'm sure we will again in the future if you're interested in that. This next step in the checklist pertains to both joining a new lab or starting a new project. So DMPs are that high-level overview of your project, but you also need to document specific aspects of your research workflow, such as your file naming conventions, the long-term file formats you're going to be saving your data in, your directory structure, and how you'll handle file versioning. Ultimately, your data workflow will state exactly where files are going, how they're going to be named, and how you're going to be organizing them in other parts of this project. At this point, you should also consider whether or not you're going to use an electronic lab notebook or perhaps protocols.io for sharing methods. So trying to get more detail oriented about your project and making sure it's documented. So I'm briefly going to go over the different parts of the data workflow, starting with file naming conventions. File naming conventions should be documented so that others in your lab or department can follow this standard. They should be descriptive and provide just enough contextual information, be human readable, so that others can easily find what's in each file. The file names should also be machine readable. You want to avoid spaces and special characters and instead use dashes and underscores. You could also use default ordering, such as alphabetically, numerically, or chronologically, and you want to keep your file names short. Ideally, your file name should just be descriptive enough and contextual enough that others can quickly identify what that file is if it were to live outside of the folder. And you don't want to be too generic. You want to think critically about your file names. So instead of using mydata.csv, use a descriptive file name like 2020-0507-gene expression and so on. And this is a good file name because the date is first and it's in the ISO standard for date. So that way people in other parts of the world will be using that same structure if they're also using the ISO standard. The name also contains information about the file contents, and the file can be sorted meaningfully by the date. But keep in mind, you don't want all of the metadata about your files in the file name. Most metadata will be in the form of a README file or your lab notes, which I'll go over shortly. So when choosing a format for your data, you need to consider later activities in the data lifecycle. At the data collection stage, it's important to choose a format that is uncompressed and that is flexible in order to enable the most amount of use. So to maximize accessibility and the long-term value of your data, it's preferable to store your data in formats that have freely available specifications. The appropriate file type will depend on the data being stored. So for example, numeric measurements, text, images, or video. In most cases, when working with instruments that collect data, you will have your data stored in a closed file format because of that proprietary equipment. Accessing your data really should not require proprietary software, if possible, or hardware, or the need to purchase a commercial license. But this is mostly because proprietary formats can change over time. Developers can go out of business and you won't be able to access the software that at one point opened these files, and you don't have to pay for licenses to actually open these files years later down the line. So in the best case, your data file should be both non-proprietary or open, unencrypted and uncompressed. And the table on this slide shows examples of preferred open formats for data. So when you're preparing to publish or share your data, transform files to preferred formats to allow for increased accessibility. One of the essential components of successful research data management is the establishment of a filing or directory structure for your records. You should structure your folders, whether paper or electronic, to correspond to how your data is generated and complement your proposed or existing workflows. Established file plans demonstrate consistency and continuity in record keeping. Ideally, you should arrange your data in a hierarchical structure, so meaning folders within folders. And in order to create this folder structure, you want to identify ways to divide the data into categories or attributes. These attributes may be high-level projects based on time, data collection, or file type. So think about how you would go about looking for a file and try to avoid overlapping categories. Don't let your folders get too big and your structures too deep. And most importantly, be consistent and document your filing system so that others can follow along and be able to locate your data and files for the project. The next part of your data workflow is version control. Records change, especially if you're collaborating. So version control is used to capture a snapshot of a file or all of the project's files at any moment in time. And it allows you to easily review the history of the project, manage future changes, and revert to previous working versions if needed. And to keep in mind, version control is not just for code or data. There are platforms and software that enable seamless collaboration, so many people can work on a file at once, and all these changes are captured in real time. So there are a few strategies for versioning files and documents. You can start off with the basic approach, which is where you're capturing versioning manually in the file names. An intermediate approach is using a platform with version control built-in capabilities, such as Open Science Framework or other options shown here. And then the advanced way is using a version control software such as Git. So just becoming acquainted with the different tools that are out there and which approaches works best for you and your team. When starting a new project, you also need to consider metadata, which is hugely important. Well thought out metadata facilitates better understanding, use, and sharing of experimental data for both now and in the future. And it helps researchers to discover, access, repurpose, and cite data over the long term, facilitating lasting archival preservation of data. Metadata describes the relevant information about the data, so it answers the who, what, when, where, and why questions. So when joining a new project, you should determine if there's already a metadata standard in place, determine where the metadata will be stored, establish a new metadata standard if required, and establish a controlled vocabulary. The Longwood Medical Area Research Data Management website has a lot more information about metadata standards that you can look at and get an idea of what can be included. But at a minimum, you need to know who created the data, when the data were created or published, and a title or descriptive name used to refer to the data set. So when you're receiving data, metadata helps you understand the data you want to use. Think about the types of details you want to know about the data you receive. What processes were used for creating the data? What did the values mean in the table? What software do I need to use in order to read the data? And can I give this data to someone else? On the other hand, when you're providing data, it really helps to have this metadata so that people will know how to access the data and what they need to in order to actually be able to reuse in a meaningful way. So when sharing your data, include helpful information such as why were the data created, what limitations is there on the data, and how should you cite the data. Put yourself in the shoes of someone else who has never seen the data and what information that you think would be necessary in order to understand the associated data files. Lastly, I just want to go over README files. README files are used to document changes to files or file names within a folder, explain file naming conventions for future reference, and they specifically accompany files being deposited into a repository. A README file should contain basic project information, such as the title, contributions, grant information, contact information, all locations where data live, including backups, useful information about the files and how they're organized, and an explanation of your file naming conventions and abbreviations for future reference. So to create a README file, you can just use a text editor such as Notepad because it can be opened in different, it's a non-proprietary format. So you don't want to use something like Microsoft Word to be saving your README files. And you should be having a README file for each distinct data set. So there's a lot that goes into the research workflow, from the DMP to creating all the metadata that's associated with your project, but you really need to be aware of this at the beginning of a project or start joining in a new lab so you understand the full data lifecycle and what's expected at each step. So I just wanted to ask a quick poll question. So when you joined your lab or joined a new research project, were you given instructions on how to name your files and where to save them? So if you can take a minute and just say yes or no, or you're not sure if there's any that exist. It's always interesting to see what people experience and what they're hoping to get, maybe take away from this checklist is maybe creating some of your own workflows that will help in the process later. So it looks like right now, majority of people say no, they do not we're not given instructions. But I will keep this open for a sec, but yeah, it's a real interesting thing. And I hope for those who don't have it, please try to take away some of these points and create something for yourself. All right. And now I will hand this over to Sarah, who will go over storage.
Alrighty, thanks, Megan. So I'm going to go over storage today. Now that we've talked a little bit about planning and how to think about data management as you're entering a lab or starting a new project, thinking about data management plans and data use agreements, we're going to shift a little bit and talk specifically about storage. So if you remember that image we showed you at the beginning of the session, the data lifecycle image, the management of storage was at the center of the image. And that's because we've found here at Harvard that people need to be thinking about storage at every phase of the life cycle. So as you're beginning a project and entering a lab, you'll want to know where you're storing your data as you start to generate the data. But as you get further along in the project, you might need to shift the storage as you begin to analyze the data, and then thinking about where you're going to put the data as you finish up the project for long-term storage. Maybe you'll want to preserve some of the data in an archive, and then finally where you want to share the data, usually in a data repository as outlined by your grant or funding agency. And so for this section, we're going to focus on what resources are available to you, understanding some of the best practices related to storage, and then knowing where to go if you need assistance with finding the right storage option. There we go. So some of the goals, again, for this section, we're going to review some of the resources in place, both here at HMS and also some of the other institutions. You'll familiarize yourself with existing storage resources. There are quite a few options that I'll go over in more detail that exhibit different behaviors, performance, and access. And then we'll talk a little bit about collaborative data and where you should be placing data if you're going to be sharing it with people within your department, but also outside of the institution. So as you join a lab or begin a project, you're going to start generating data. So you want to familiarize yourself with any existing resources that the lab might have, but there are so many storage options available to you, and they will depend based on the behavior, performance, and how you need to access the data. We do recommend that you divide your data between multiple storage options. This is a best practice that allows you to have data in the correct location depending on how you're going to be using it. So here at HMS, we have 4 main storage file systems. They were recently renamed because we wanted to promote the service that they offer. So if they look a little bit different than you are familiar with, I'll go over them in a bit more detail, but they basically come down to our active compute file system, which is also known as the high performance compute cluster, or O2, the active collaboration space, which is your research.files or your group folders that you might use within your department. We have a system called Scratch, which is for transient files, so files that you're generating as part of your analysis, but don't actually need to keep for any extended period of time. And then we have our standby storage space, and this is actually a new file system that we were rolling out, and it's for long-term storage. And I'll go over a bit more about each of those options in a minute. We also want you to think about software and backups. So HMS IT does maintain the file systems, and therefore they do back up the file systems. So we recommend keeping your data on premise, so within the HMS file systems, rather than putting them in offsite storage, as they're not maintained by IT, and therefore if you delete it or misplace it, we're not able to assist you with that. So something to keep in mind. We also offer a lot of software licenses. Some are free, some come with a cost. So more information about those is available on our website. And again, I just wanted to highlight the research computing O2 environment, the high performance compute cluster. So that's a shared high performance space. It includes dedicated hardware for high memory and also GPU intensive tasks. And then in terms of the Chan School, they have their own storage systems. They have the S Drive, which is their department shared storage location. And then each individual has the option to get a P drive or their personal storage. They also have the option to work with Andy Ross, who offers complimentary consulting on security compliance and some best practices. He talks about IRB requirements, VPN. So if you have any questions related to the Chan School and information security, please reach out to Andy Ross. And lastly, FAS has their own version of a high performance compute cluster called Cannon. So a bit more information about the 4 main file systems here at HMS. We've created a really nice table that talks about the purpose, write and read speeds, a lot of really specific information about each file system. And that's available at the URL there at the bottom on the Research Computing website. The active compute environment is, again, the high performance compute environment. It's intended for active research data that you're frequently using, modifying, or computing against. And similarly, the active collaboration space is your department shared file. So these are folders that you use within your department that allow you to share files either with your lab members, but also with other collaborators. And it is intended for active research data as well. The Scratch space is on the O2 cluster, so you're able to do computation, but it's designed for transient files. So it's really intended to be a temporary storage space because if you don't actively use the data for more than 30 days, it will be deleted. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's great when you're doing active analysis, but if you want to keep any permanent data, we recommend moving it off of the Scratch space as it will be deleted. Lastly, there's the standby storage space, and this is for infrequently accessed data. So this is HMS's version of long-term storage. You can also use it as an intermediary location. So if you are getting ready to move data to cold storage in order to accommodate that 7-year retention period that Meghan was talking about, you can use standby as a intermediary space, so you can organize and prepare your research data before you move it either to an archive or to cold storage. And just a bit more about high performance compute. So it's computing power that has higher performance than your typical desktop computer. And it allows you to solve these larger issues that you would be unable to do so just using your general desktop power. It makes your workflows more efficient. So it allows you to do complex computations, usually with scheduled scripts. And it automates your workflow so you can be more productive. And it also improves the reproducibility of your work. It does require use of command line interface, so you will have to be a little bit more technologically savvy. But it does offer storage space separate from your central department folders. So it is another location that you can store. And as I briefly mentioned before, we do like to encourage that you keep multiple copies of your data. So you have a copy, for example, on your laptop computer, a separate copy on your hard drive, and then maybe a copy of your entire computer on a Harvard Crash Plan or a Code 42, which are the supported software. Another example is your laptop computer and maybe Dropbox. So maybe you have a shared department folder on Dropbox or a shared lab folder. And then again, a complete backup of your computer on a approved Crash Plan or Code 42. I did want to briefly mention that there are some policies related to confidentiality, data security, and intellectual property from the university, and they govern the ownership and disposition of intellectual property. We do recommend consulting with your PI or lab manager if you have any questions related to these policies, but just make sure that you're aware of some of the basic requirements as stipulated by those policies. And then we want to talk a little bit about securing your data. So Harvard has 5 security levels, ranging from 1 to 5. And these just ensure that you're storing data in the correct location based on the security level. So data security level 1 is any publicly available and unrestricted data. This includes published research data and any data that's available in a public space. And then we have level 2, which is unpublished non-sensitive research data. This is identifiable or not. It's just any active research data. We have level 3, which is sensitive data. And this is regulated data or data that could be damaging to a subject's financial standing, economic prospects, personal relationships. And most of the storage systems through HMS are level 3 security. So any data that fits within security level 3, you can store on an HMS file system. Level 4 is going to be sensitive data. Examples of this could be social security numbers or HIPAA related data, so clinical data. And then lastly, we have level 5, which is going to be highly sensitive data. It could put someone at severe risk of harm, or the data has contractual requirements for exceptional security measures. So again, most of the file systems at HMS are level 3. If you need level 4 or level 5 storage locations, you will have to reach out to HMS IT, as it will have to go in a special secure location. So again, just to go over some sensitive research data. So what is sensitive research data? It's any data subject to regulations, such as the GDPR. It's confidential information, high risk and extreme information. Basically any data that could put someone at severe risk of harm if the information is made available to the public. So just a quick takeaway, if you can add your answers to the chat. How do the high performance compute clusters, such as O2 or Canon, how do these storage systems differ from other options available at Harvard? And a follow-up question, what type of data should be stored on these compute clusters? So again, please add any answers to the chat. So if you were going to store data in O2 or Canon, why would you want to store data there versus in another location like Dropbox or your department folder? So one of the main benefits to the high performance compute cluster, especially, comply with property and confidentiality rights and standards, correct, yep. So it's overseen by HMSIT. So a lot of your standards that are required by grants or funding agencies are going to be covered. We do a lot of backups and maintain security levels. Any other comments? So I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that it's designed for computation, right? So you're able to do a lot more complex computation using the compute clusters versus just storing data on your hard drive or your laptop or even your departmental folders. Those locations are mainly for storage versus the high performance compute clusters, which you're able to store data, but they also offer the computation as well. And then in terms of the type of data that you want to store, it's any active data that you're accessing, modifying, and analyzing. And then as you start to complete your project, you'll want to move that data off of the HPCs and onto a more long-term storage option. So I will move this back to Julie, who will talk about the next phase, which is sharing.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so for sharing, we are focusing on why it's important or worthwhile to share your data and what help can you get with managing your data at the end of your project. So a key aspect, again, of data management involves not only making your articles available, but also that data and code and any materials you may have used to conduct that research. And when talking about sharing, we want to facilitate discovery and accessibility of that data. So the next section or step of our checklist is to review any publisher or funder requirements. So remember that major national funding agencies like the NSF or the NIH require requests for funding contain that data management plan or DMP that Meghan talked about. And these should address how the proposed project will comply with your agency's data sharing policies. And in addition to meeting funder requirements, sharing data also benefits the scientific community and society by providing more opportunities for collaboration, better science, and hopefully well-informed policy decisions. And there are a lot of parties with interest in your research data. It's not just yourself or your funder. So be sure to review your publisher and funding agency or other policies to ensure that you're meeting those requirements. And examples of these data sharing policies are shared on the slide. Also, for sharing, we shouldn't only focus on outward public sharing. We also want to ensure we are working collaboratively with our colleagues and project members. So you should review some collaborative tools already in use for an existing project, or choose relevant tools, for a new project. And some examples of collaborative tools include Dropbox, some shared folders, and wiki platforms. And the tools you may use, really depend on where the research is happening. Again, it could be all internal within the university, say at Harvard, or you may be working collaboratively with institutions across the world. So the tools you can choose from may be dictated by what is available at your institution and also what type of data you are working with. So recall the research data security levels that Sarah just reviewed. And this chart for Harvard and the medical school show which collaborative tools align with which data security level. So for example, Harvard does offer Dropbox business accounts, but you can only store up to level 3 data there. And these are great resources to ensure that you are using collaborative platforms correctly and securely. So as I mentioned earlier, data management is a part of data sharing. So we need some infrastructure to help to support the sharing and discovery and long-term accessibility of our research data. And this is the role of repositories. Saying it's on my flash drive, just email me for a copy is really not a good choice. And even methods like posting data to a personal website or via Google Drive, make it challenging for others to discover that data. So when you are ready to publish your data more formally, you should review potential data repositories. Review public data repositories may be already established for an existing project, or choose a relevant data repository for your project. For some projects or scientific areas, data repositories may not be established yet for the data types that you're producing. So you could either choose to develop a new database for your project or work with a general repository to meet your needs. And so why is it best practice to share data in a repository? Well, repositories provide that technical infrastructure for access and curation of your research data. They provide a nice persistent identifier in the citation for your data. They provide a framework for you to describe your data using metadata standards. They archive your data in a trusted place for long-term access. And repositories are compliant with funders and journal requirements. Again, there are many types of repositories, so ensure you are picking the right platform for your work. And you can explore multiple options on our data management website. So I also want to encourage you to think of sharing things other than research articles and data, but also any materials and methods you may have used. So for example, you may have run into situations where you have to spend time recreating reagents, or sometimes you use a misidentified tool. Additionally, labs have problems with reagent organization, validation, storage, and distribution. So reagent repositories like AdGene help solve these logistical problems. Additionally, research methods have a history of being mostly unuseful when published within research articles. You may encounter a string of citations to follow, or comments like methods followed standard procedures, which is sometimes unhelpful if you don't know what those standard procedures were. So better practice is to think of a protocol as a brief, modular, self-contained scientific publication. And protocols.io is a nice platform that supports the creation and sharing of these research methods. And both materials and methods records can be attached and linked to your research article. And this, provides just the full context of that project. So another collaborative tool and sharing resource is an electronic lab notebook. When collaborating on a team, it is important to establish who will have access to what information and how access will be provided. So ELNs help you share research files with the group, and they do have some nice advantages over, a paper system. You can enter protocols, observations, notes, and other data using your computer or maybe a mobile device. They are searchable, shareable, and accessible from outside the lab. A specific platform I like that I'll just highlight quickly is the Open Science Framework. OSF is nice because it is cloud-based management system providing project structuring with a wiki for documentation, file versioning, and access or permission controls. It also integrates with many other platforms that you or your team may be using, like Dropbox, GitHub, or Google Drive. And since it's possible that members of a group will be using, many of these different tools and platforms, the Open Science Framework is a great connector for everyone on that research team. But the number of available ELN tools, is increasing. There are a lot out there. So you can use this nice matrix on our website to help you compare and contrast many of the solutions that are available. And you can go in depth on individual platforms as well. And the goal of this matrix is to help you identify a platform that works for your lab group to meet your research needs. All right, so the final step on our checklist is to consult or initiate a DUA. So like Megan talked about at the beginning of our project, a data use agreement may be needed if you are planning to share data results from a project. So like with our incoming data, outgoing data from Harvard and the institution to a third party will be shared and governed under specific conditions and regulations. So you need to initiate an agreement that will allow that to happen. Okay, so I think we can wrap up the sharing section with some questions. So let me open the next poll. So the first question, think about the collaborative tools that you may use. There's a nice list that you can choose multiple from. And if there's anything, missing from the list, we would love to hear, what you are using. So you can add that to the chat if you would like. And, we will go more in depth into collaborative tools in our next class. So you can learn more on Friday with collaborative tools. And then the second question, have you ever been required to share your data? This is becoming increasingly, asked for from our funders and journal editors. So if you haven't published anything yet, you may not have run into these requirements. So I'll give you another minute or two to think back to our sharing section. Great, so I'll share these results with everyone. It looks like a lot of you are using Google Drive. That's a very, easy to use platform for people to work collaboratively. A lot of you are using Dropbox. As I mentioned, Harvard does have Harvard business accounts. Some people at Harvard also have Google Drive accounts, which is great. We don't have that at the medical school, so we rely on Dropbox and OneDrive. Microsoft Teams is becoming a nice collaborative platform for people. As I mentioned, Open Science Framework is a great way to connect all these people. See, some of you are using ELNs. We would love to hear what kind of electronic lab notebook platform you are using. And then, yeah, so some of you have been asked or required to share your data, and some of you have not. So just the takeaway here is to look for those requirements in the future from your funder and your publisher if you are publishing. Great. So let's wrap up today's session. So, incorporating data management into the onboarding process is important because it enables the continuity of our research projects. It facilitates data sharing and reuse. It reduces research and data storage costs. And it promotes this, concept of data reproducibility. So let us know in the chat if you plan to use this onboarding checklist to get everyone in the group, lab, or project all following these data management practices. We really encourage you to take these checklists and tailor them to your groups or lab needs. And if you're from another institution, you are also encouraged to request these checklists that you can then modify with appropriate resources for your institution. So also, we don't want to forget about the offboarding process for when people leave. We do have another checklist to guide the knowledge transfer process. And this ensures the important information is recorded when a person leaves a project or lab. And this document should, really be reviewed in conjunction with the onboarding checklist we went through today, as offboarding procedures, really should be planned for early in the research process, not kind of like thrown together right before someone leaves. So I encourage you to look for an offboarding class that will hopefully hold in the spring. You can find both of these checklists at the link that I've provided in the chat. So just to finish up today's session, we do have some upcoming webinars, so be sure to register at the link provided on the slide. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. The recording and the slides will be posted on our website. You will also receive an email notification when they are available. And we would love to appreciate your feedback on today's session. So please fill out the survey at the link provided on the slide.